So we're back for another deep dive, and today we're going to be talking about
Yeah.
something that's a little bit heavy,
Right.
but it's a topic that we think is really important.
Absolutely.
So we're going to be diving into the Bodo Oil Spill.
Okay.
Have you heard about this?
I have, yeah. It was a pretty major environmental disaster.
Yeah, and we're going to be using this really chilling firsthand account from Eco Nightmares to guide us through it.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
it takes us to Bodo, this village in Nigeria. Like, imagine this place where life revolves around this beautiful river. You know, it's their livelihood.
Yeah.
But it's not all sunshine and roses, as you can imagine.
Right.
So we're going to be talking about the aftermath of this oil spill and the real human cost of what happened.
And looking at what we can all learn from it, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe you can set the scene for us a little bit.
Yeah.
What was Bodo like before this devastating spill?
Well, from everything I've read about it, Bodo was this really thriving community. Like you said, their lives were completely intertwined with this river. It was everything to them: fishing, farming, even just like their daily life and sustenance.
Yeah, I mean, even just reading that little bit in the source, you can really picture it. Like, it sounds so idyllic, and you just can't imagine it turning into the nightmare that it did.
Right. It's hard to fathom.
So in 2008, everything changed. And the source talks about this, like, heavy, bitter smell of oil just permeating the air. I mean, can you imagine waking up and that's the first thing you smell?
It's all, I've smelled, oil spills before, but nothing on that scale I can't imagine.
And the river, which had been so vibrant and full of life, it just turned black, like completely covered in crude oil. And fishermen who depended on that river were pulling up nets full of dead fish.
It's just devastating. It's like their entire world flipped upside down just like that.
And, what's really striking is that this wasn't some freak accident. This was a pipeline, an aging one that hadn't been properly maintained, and it ruptured.
Right. And unfortunately, that wasn't even that uncommon in that region at the time. There were a lot of issues with pipelines.
But what really made this tragedy so much worse was the response, or the lack thereof.
Yeah, the oil company responsible, they just completely denied the scale of the spill initially.
Yeah, and it took years for them to just even acknowledge the true extent of the damage.
It makes you think about those people in Bodo. They were just left to deal with the consequences while the company was trying to sweep it under the rug.
Yeah, and, the source talks about the impact on the people, and it wasn't just the environmental damage. It was this complete disruption of their way of life.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. Farmers couldn't farm their land anymore because it was contaminated.
Right, and clean water became scarce. People were breathing in these toxic fumes like 24/7.
It just completely upended their lives. And their social structures, their economic stability, even their culture, it was all deeply affected.
Yeah, it's just heartbreaking to imagine what they went through. I mean, the source even talks about how people lost their sense of community, their sense of hope.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that these aren't just statistics. These are real people whose lives were completely turned upside down.
Exactly. And it wasn't until 2015, a full 5 years after the spill, that the company finally admitted to the true scale of the disaster. And even then, how do you even begin to compensate for that kind of loss?
I mean, it's a really complex question, right? Like, how do you put a price tag on the loss of an entire way of life?
Right. Like, how do you compensate for childhoods that were stolen by this environmental tragedy?
It's just impossible. And while they did eventually receive some financial compensation, money can't really fix everything.
No, it can't. And, even with the cleanup efforts that have been made, Bodo is still struggling to recover.
Yeah, the river's ecosystem, it's still damaged. It's a constant reminder of what happened.
It's a really sobering reminder that these environmental disasters, they have these profound and long-lasting human costs. And Bodo's story, it's just one example of how fragile ecosystems can be and how devastating the consequences are when they're disrupted.
Absolutely. And it really makes you question, what responsibility do we all have in preventing these kinds of disasters from happening in the future?
Yeah.
What steps can we take, both as individuals and as corporations, to ensure that stories like Bodo's don't become the norm?
It's definitely a lot to think about, and I hope our listeners will keep these questions in mind as they learn more about this issue.
Me too. It's an important conversation to have.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today. It's been heavy, but it's important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to our listeners, we hope you'll join us next time as we delve into another compelling story.